Good morning to our friends in Asia, good afternoon, good evening. And we have our global audience back, and yeah, we hope you're enjoying this the first day of our conference, first two sessions out the way, and now we get down dirty, having fun, talking about the digital thread of process with our old friend Robert Balajian from Sodius Willett. And so Robert is, in fact, the Chief Product Officer at Sodius Willett, and before his role, where he led engineering and research teams, developing tools and deploying systems there in the automotive industry. Robert is a provisional ASPICE assessor and has a Master's of Science degree in software engineering from a CMU. And so we're very honored to welcome Robert back. And yeah, I'm sure you're going to really love this topic about the digital thread of process realization. Thank you, Robert, and take it away.
Thank you so much, Duncan. It always sounds great when I hear it coming out of your voice. I feel special. I feel in a great place. So let's get started here. Thanks everybody for taking time out of your day. I want to make sure that we make good use of your time. And to give you a real quick introduction of Sodius Willett, we're across the globe. So Detroit in the US, as well as in France and in Germany. We tend to be where you guys are. We're working in aerospace, defense, automotive. That's our business. We're engineers at heart, and we're here to be able to help people make better tools. And that's really our goal, is to make sure the engineering enterprise works together, it's integrated, and allows you to be able to build better products. That's really our whole goal. And when I talked to Duncan and the team at Method Park here recently about this topic and having a chance to be able to speak to you, it kind of brought back, how did we actually get here? As Duncan said, I actually came from industry, spent about 15 years in automotive, running process and tools groups. I tend to actually come from a tool perspective, but I wanted to be able to bring that back into, I like tools because they help us with process. And so I met the Method Park team years and years ago, and they won me over by talking about the 7 meters of process in the wall that was beautiful, but not actionable. And that's really what we're trying to get to when we cover between process and tools, is making things actionable. And it's been interesting as being a product officer here at Sodius Willett. We've been deploying these OSLC Connect tools and OSLC tools in general for the last 5 years or so. And what I find interesting about it is that I spend significantly less time on the products themselves and the features of the tools, but necessarily the process they're trying to enable. And that's actually a good segue into what we're trying to do here, is simplify how we think about tools to be able to enable process. And we shouldn't talk about tools without process, because that's the whole reason why we have tools, to enable the process flow that we want to have. And so that's what we're really going to talk about today. And when we speak in this engineering space, we often talk about the digital thread, and I thought it was intriguing to be able to think about, what is the digital thread? How do we think about that? How do we simplify that? Because that's really what we're trying to do when we're integrating these concepts together, is really, how do we get to those? And so quite simply, the digital thread is the traceability of the digital twin. So it's how do we take our digital artifacts and connect them together? And furthermore, it's the relationship between the artifacts that make our design. I mean, these are basic concepts, they're simple concepts, but we want to be able to make these more precise. And how do we actually look at those from a tool standpoint? And as I've been trying to integrate these tools together, make it easy to use, we've come, I think, to some kind of what we hope are actually thoughtful conclusions, but helps us be able to simplify how we think about artifacts in general. And we classify them in a small set of groups. And I'll try to connect those back to our processes that we're working on as well. So first and foremost, we have assets. We have these are the artifacts of our digital thread. These are the things that are entities. These are requirements, they're test cases, they're model elements, they're code. These are things that we version. So these are the deliverables that an engineering team produces. They're the work products of our process. And we're collecting these together. What's unique about them is they're individually versioned, but we also can use specific versions, meaning that these are the entities that I might reuse. And what we create then is a thread, a chain of versions that we can merge, branch, and utilize. And this is the distinguishing factor. And we see this across the artifacts that we produce. So whether I'm creating a requirement, whether I'm creating a test case or building code, I'm always dealing with specific versions that I'm creating. And I need to understand how they relate to other versions of that same artifact. Now, different but related to this is what we'll call our workflow artifacts. So these are the things that have states and sequences. They have an outcome. These are things like our change requests, our reviews, our tasks. These are things that focus our process, really. What's interesting about them is we have history, but we have no versions. So we have this temporal context. We know what happened on specific dates. We know evolution of that, but we're never going to reuse this artifact. We simply need to understand how it progressed in history and what were the artifacts and relationships on at a particular point in time. And these things are owned by projects, and these are teams that are actually executing our process. It's imperative for them to understand what artifacts they are and how they relate to others. Occasionally, we might clone these artifacts when we're trying to reuse some process elements or reenact something on a different project, but essentially we don't create versions of these. And we potentially have some hierarchies in terms of how we create subtasks and sub-activities, but these are the things that we really want to focus on of driving our process flow. What's intriguing is we talked about the digital thread, we're talking about how do we do traceability? And inherently with that is this concept of linking. Now, what we've looked at when we look at like OSLC and these standards of how to do linking is links are actually pretty simple. We have a role, we have a relationship that link has, and it points to a particular artifact. So it has a source, it has an endpoint, and so it's usually owned by whatever's the elaborating or referencing artifact. And we treat this as an attribute because we want to version that information together with the artifact. It's something that we want to persist on that artifact and contain its version, its history. And we want to be able to have a specific point of direction, but we want to be able to traverse it bidirectionally. That's where tools help us be able to do that. And what's intriguing though is we always want to point to like a basic unversioned artifact, because versioning is something that has a contextual importance to us. We want to be able to make sure that we pick the right version of our artifact when we reuse elements. So the simple example is thinking about linking is pretty simple when I think about from a test case validates a requirement. When it becomes intriguing is when I have these persistent set of versions of how do I know which version of that requirement that my test case actually navigates to and traces to. And that's really the important part. We want to be able to make sure these tools help us navigate, understand the context that I'm working in. Now, I have a slide here, but actually I think I'm a tools guy, so I like live examples a little bit more. So let's take a look at something that I think is pretty common, pretty persistent with most of the people here. We have a change artifact here. So just a JIRA work item, we have our OSLC Connect solution here, so we can do linking. And we'll do version contextual linking, because when we work with change artifacts, we have a natural process flow. As I work on a change, I want to work on a specific version of requirement. So we can see this link here to this, I need to support 802.11b. This is what I'm working on in a particular release, a particular version that I want to work with. Now, if it happens that suddenly I decide that I either can't fulfill that requirement in a particular release, or the context changes that I need to move this to a new feature, a new release, it's as simple as me being able to come into these tools and be able to say, I actually want to do this in a different release. Now, the intriguing part is that I should think that in a different release, I probably have a different version, a set of requirements. And what's going to happen here is you see that this requirement here will actually update and change. Now, this is what tools do to be able to enable our process. So in this case, it now says, well, actually, if you're working on release 2, the requirements are actually 802.11a, b, and g. This is actually how our tool should work to be able to help our process, how it condenses and allows us to be able to manage the configuration. So I have a link to an artifact. As I move to a different release, as I move to a different version, I'm going to get a different source artifact. And the nice thing is here is that while I'm pointing to this generic artifact, I'm going to contextualize it for the version. And then I can have these concepts like rich hovers that OSLC provides me, so I can see into my requirements management tool. In this case, it's DNG, Doors Next. It could be Doors Classic. It could be Polarian. Any of these tools support this notion of being able to navigate to them and have these rich previews. And that's really the whole point of having a configuration and having a context. We want to be able to navigate to those versions. And these are important for the digital thread as a whole. And we've always had these types of configurations. And the examples that I have here are things like when we have a Git branch, it's a particular configuration of software. When I'm looking at a released requirements document coming out of a DOORS or any other requirements management tool, that's a specific configuration of requirements. It's a collection of versions of those requirements. The same thing goes when I start working at PLM tools like Windchill. I have a bill of material. It has a hierarchy of parts. It has versions of those parts. Those are specific to context. And we can think of these things in dynamic senses. There's streams, there's things that are evolving when I'm developing them, or that can be historical, that can be a static baseline that I might reference. And the interesting thing that we're really getting into here is now we have these local repository configurations that we're very comfortable with. But essentially, when we talk about the digital thread, we're talking about an enterprise or a global cross-repository configuration. How do I identify that? How do I pick this version of my PLM tool, this version of my requirements, this version of my test cases, and have my links be able to navigate well? So when we think of this digital twin, our digital assets as a whole are more of a web. So we might have a collection of version of requirements, 1, 2, 3, a version of test cases, a version of software. What we're trying to do is figure out how do I navigate between those. And really what I want to get to is an instance. So this is actually my digital thread. My digital thread is this pathway, this collection that I navigate through to be able to pick this version of a requirement, this version of the test case, this version of the software to be able to tell me about a specific point in time. And really, what builds on top of this is the notion that these digital artifacts don't come in isolation. What they come in is from the execution of your process with your workflows. This is how the workflow entities relate to those digital artifacts. So they're telling us when we're going to create artifacts, how we're going to assemble those artifacts, how we need to configure those artifacts. And this is how process and these digital artifacts come together. And so what we need to do is figure out how we realize this digital thread. And this is the experience that we have from like a tools integration standpoint. How do we actually pull these things together? And what's really important? And what's intriguing for us is that when we talk about tool integration, we're working with a collection of people, whether it's the end user, whether it's the process team, whether it's the IT team, they all have needs and motivations on how they want to have tools to work and how to be able to make these things work well. And so what we're targeting here is how do we condense these requirements down? So we have some IT requirements about how do we deal with these enterprise repositories? So we have these different unique vendors. They all have their different user and security needs. We need to have audit support, especially in our aerospace and defense space. And we want to have interoperability. We want to link between these. And then we have things that are just natural from a reporting standpoint. It's nice to create links, but they're only valuable when I can report on them, when I can give evidence, can I determine trends, can I provide proof when we're doing assessments, whether we're doing ASPICE or one of our other standards. And then what's been interesting, I mean, we've had these trends going on for a long time now, and obviously the last year has really bent these trends even more, which is the way engineers work. We work remotely. We work wherever our laptop takes us and wherever the network goes. So things like browser as the client platform, having remote work so I can access anything anywhere, but it has to be secure. The more prevalence of having cloud access to features, whether it's your own local cloud, managed cloud, or whether it's a public cloud, all these things are coming together and we need to integrate these tools. And from an engineering standpoint, the most important thing to me is to be able to make sure that engineers find these useful. And so that's actually the user engagement part of this, which has really been a focus of our team, is to be able to make sure, let's take these technologies and understand what's important to the engineer. The tools have to feel natural. They have to be able to navigate through a click of a button to another tool. It has to feel like a platform across all these different vendor tools and not just, hey, data's been copied from one place to another. So that's really been our goal, being able to bring that together. And fortunately for us, there's been some wickedly smart people that have been out in the industry, both from the end users as well as tool vendors, helping build this OSLC standard, which really brings the imperatives to life in terms of how do I preserve repositories. OSLC is about keeping distributed systems of record. So I'm not going to copy data, but I'm going to link between them. All these tools have their own unique data model. It has value. Let's persist it. We're going to support linking across these projects. So it's important that we understand the semantics of these links. We need to have user interface integration points. So how do I embed a picker, basically a selector for what I want to link to, and how do I do previews? These things are important to us. And we always want to be enterprise approved. The only time that people are deploying this is when they have rich IT landscapes. They don't have one tool that answers their question. They have 50 tools. How do we make these come together? How do we have distributed topologies across the networks and make these things work? That's what we do, and that's what we support with this standard. And so what's interesting is we can realize this thread, and so we can see how this thread of engineering assets come together. So think of this as just a simple change request for a requirement. And so I might have a change record in Jira that starts my flow. I'm going to link it to a set of requirements, so now I can actually see my requirement from my Jira artifact. I'm going to go ahead and create a change set within, say, doors next. So not only do I have relationships to requirements, now I have a group collection of changes that I've applied. I now have the ability to be able to navigate and be able to see these changes from my Jira issue because I have these live links. I can go look at this change set. I can see which artifacts are there, see what changes have been there. And this is how these tools are collaborating. I'm not just navigating through a web browser to be able to do this. And I can even go to the point of having an approval flow, which means that I have attributes on my Jira artifact that say that others have seen it, approve the content that's there, and force that to be able to make sure that that happens before I deliver that. I love this from a tools perspective. I love this because it enforces process, but I don't visibly see the process. And I think that's the critical part that we want to get to is how do we actually make sure that people are aware of the process? How do we make it visible to them? How do we make them be able to be more comfortable? Because we're definitely not going to send 7 meters of process to everybody to put in their home office and put across their kitchen wall as they're trying to work at their kitchen table. We want them to be active for that. And that's really where I want to go with is how do we realize process in the digital thread? There's things that we're doing, there's things that the industry is doing, and there's things that we want to see other people help us realize as well. And so what's the big picture? I mean, the big picture really is how we be able to identify these assets are really our design manifestations in relationship. These are the twin. And whenever somebody mentions the digital twin, they're talking about this, but we need to make sure we talk about how those things manifest themselves. How do we create those? And that's really our workflow, which is driven by a process, which really drives us to create these assets. So our digital thread that we have is really driven by process, and that's what we really want to encourage. We want to encourage, we want to enact, we want to engage people on the process, because once they're executing the process, they're going to do it much, much better. And as a tools guy for the longest time, we've always been trying to encourage people. It's not trying to force people, it's trying to encourage people to follow process. And we find if we make it easy for engineers to follow good process and good practice, they will do it. If it's hard to do things outside the process, they won't do it. So let's make it as easy as possible. And then those are the types of things that we're trying to do. So first and foremost, all about OSLC is how do we actually connect repositories. So unconnected repositories, so things without dynamic links, create silos. This is my tool over here, that's your tool over there. Occasionally one might put a synchronization tool in the middle that copies data, but that only creates proxies. That doesn't actually create collaboration. That allows you to be able to create a sandbox that somebody else's stuff's over there. So we want to be able to connect those repositories, and we do that with OSLC. We can create these relationships between these repositories and how they relate. What sort of relationships and flows do they have? We also want to be able to have these dynamic links because they encourage things. So if we look at this relationship here, I have a requirement to a change request. Just at a glance, I can tell that it's in Jira, what it was working on, as well as that strike through tells me it's complete. So there's a lot of details in terms of what's going on, what changes are happening, what things that help me better follow the process in that simple revelation. We also want to be able to have things like rich hovers. This allows me to be able to see that link, but if I need to have more detail, like see the status of an artifact, I can, or I can be able to see the description or whatever related artifacts. This allows me to stay in my context of the tool I'm in, but get enough of a glimpse of the other details without having to navigate the tool, as well as I know that detail is always up to date. So if I do need to navigate to it, I'm always going to navigate to the right version. I'm going to always be able to comment on the right version. I get that collaboration flow that I need. And then this last thing is decorator. So this has been something that we've been working on. It's kind of subtle in the image that we had below, so I want to be able to flesh it out a little bit more and bring it up. So on our links, what we've done with OSLC, we've always had these links, and we've had a dynamic update of the title like you saw, and we have rich previews. But what we haven't had is the types of things at a glance, like you saw that strike through, those things are important. What's really important is being able to understand critical attributes on these artifacts. So if I look at these artifacts, if I look at these details here, I can see already that that requirement is actually in a draft state. Now, if that is something that's important to me, so implementing a feature when the requirements in draft state is probably a bad idea. The more that I can make this visually attentive to users so they can see that detail, the more likely they're going to follow the process and be more effective. That's really what our goal is here. Now, in terms of doing encouragement, we also want to enact process. And this is really where I've had the opportunity to collaborate with the Method Park team on several different occasions over the years with customers, as well as with their development team as they've been doing this, is how do we trigger behavior from process? And it's always enlightening and always great, fun to see the growth and push that's been coming out of the stages team to be able to make sure that process doesn't interact independently. So we want to be able to have triggering behavior from a process. We want to have functionality. I know I've worked with a lot of the customers that are here on the phone about custom plugins to tools like RTC to be able to enact that process. The more our tools help us do this, the better off we'll be. What's been exciting to us is we've been trying to take this OSLC standard, which is a standard that's independent of tools. It's a standard that allows us to talk generically about collaboration, but targeting two specific things, which is how do I trigger workflows? Meaning, how do I be able to make sure that I make good decisions based on the data provided to me? So if I have these linked information, like you saw in those decorators, I understand the requirements in a draft state. Well, I should never be able to close my change request with my requirements in a draft state. We want to enact that. We want to enact that generically, and we're going to be putting that within our Jira tool coming out later this year, is to be able to have these enabled workflows. So how do I make sure that I can enact those processes and make it simple, as well as triggering? So as we do workflows, as we navigate between things, we create hierarchies, we create activities, we create child tasks. Well, we don't necessarily always create those in the same tool. We have customers that are working in Jira, they're working in Windchill. They need to connect their POM team to their AOM team. It is fantastic to be able to see how we can trigger the creation of sub-activities from this process definition through these standards. And that's really where we're going. Once we do that, then we start opening up the doors of, we don't really care what tools you're using, we care about your process. And the more that we focus on process instead of tools, the more successful teams will be in building products. Now, thinking out further, because I think that we have a fantastically smart audience here. We always want to put some thought starters out there. Where do we want to go in this industry, and how do we get there? Really, the idea in our mind is how do we reduce the barrier of access to process? How do we make it more visible? So you saw the thread that we put together. So how do we make it more visible? And I think a lot of the ideas that we have in OSLC make a lot of sense here. So wouldn't it be great on my workflow artifacts if I'm trying to understand process and what I should be doing, I have a dynamic link to my process document so I can see what activities, what behaviors I should do. And I should do rich hovers and decorators, because I'd like to be able to understand things like, what are the details about that? What are the descriptions? Oh, by the way, if I tailored out a specific element, it'd be nice to be identified that, hey, I don't need to worry about this, even though that link might be there. It's important to me. And so having those contexts, having those details there, I think are going to be instantly valuable. As we talked about those workflows, instantiating that workflow from your process independent of tool binding. As you picked your tools from your instantiation of process, that would be fabulous. And we want to be able to see those instantiated behaviors in your workflow based on your process relationship. So the notion here is that with a standard that we have like OSLC, if I have that link information on my workflow, I can necessarily navigate to as a tool like Jira in our plugin. I can navigate to my process definition to be able to pull the details, pull the semantics from it, and be able to apply those dynamically. And why is that really important? That's important because I might use different configurations, because I want to be able to make sure I get the right instance of process in my digital thread. So might be that my process is slightly different when I start out a program. So early on in the program, I might have less controls. As I get deeper in the program, I might have more controls. It'd be nice to be able to dynamically go pull what that configuration is based on the configuration I'm currently operating. What's the phase of my program? Which also gets the other direction, which is to say, from my process, there's certain elements like gate reviews, release events, things like that that I describe in my process. Those are imperatives in terms of the configuration. I want to be able to navigate to that configuration, see the assets of that configuration to do my review. It's not just the digital thread and not just process. They go hand in hand together. And these links, these configurations work hand in hand for that. So that's really where we want to see things go. And we think this movement's accelerating. So there's a few things that I think from an industry standpoint, we're definitely seeing. So IBM, Siemens, PTC, they're all adopting OSLC. There are different parts of the journey, but there's more and more capability today. We've been collaborating with all of them on our Jira interface. And we've been growing the Atlassian platform in terms of what other parts of the Atlassian platform are going to be open to this, because we know our customers use Jira, Confluence, Bitbucket. These types of extensions are things that people naturally need to have, and we have capabilities to be able to deliver that as we've done with our Jira solution. We also know that from a technology perspective, we're pushing harder on this. We want to be able to make sure there's actionable OSLC. So process actions across repositories is really the idea here. How do we trigger behaviors, not just in one entity, but across those entities? And then we have underneath this a foundation in how we build our products, but it's also how we need to enact capabilities in other people's tools. And we want to open up the ability to be able to create different link relationships, working configurations. We believe the scale is going to go bigger than the natural flows that we have today between change, requirements, and quality management. There's more things out there. As we've done with PLM, we're going to see more of these capabilities like process, which gets into the last part, which is this community. We want to see more in terms of how do we can get to this domain standard for process from a linking standpoint. This is the ability that allows us to be able to connect tools between process tools and these workflow tools as well as others, and push for more enterprise configuration. So enterprise configuration matters for process and matters for digital thread. We need to have more of those capabilities out there, more of these tools respecting those capabilities. So hopefully with that, it's been a bit of a fire hose, I know, coming out of my brain and having this, and appreciate everybody having a listen in and hopefully have a chat. I think, Duncan, we have a few moments for questions, as well as I'll be at our booth and part of our team will be at our booth as well. I'm happy to have discussions to further this.
Absolutely, I really encourage you to take the time to visit the booths of our sponsors and to really experience this virtual environment there, as well as the networking portal. Yep, so one question that we have, I think, in your presentation, we talked about end user engagement. Have you measured, how do you measure, what would you measure and there for end user engagement, and have you benchmarked end user engagement?
So I've worked in the research community and I've worked in the engineering community. From the research community, I can say I do not have the details that I would typically do for a study to be able to do that. Kind of practically and heuristically, we know we're successful in terms of end user engagement when I can explain the value proposition of these tools within 5 minutes, and people go, "Oh wow, that's what I need to get." The more questions that we get, then we have the right things. When engineers are suggesting other capabilities they need to be able to have. Simply the adoption rate that we've been having on these tools has been fabulous. And so we know we have growth and capability, growth of engagement, but the critical measure for any time that we have a tool is whether or not engineers are using it. And so if we have links, if we have people engaging and utilizing the tools, then we know we have engagement, and we want to be able to have more of that. Me personally, I want to be able to help encourage the execution of process. For those of our customers that are on the call, I think they're pretty familiar with me in terms of I love to spend time with our customers to understand how they're utilizing the tools, because those are the types of capabilities we want to have. For example, we introduced probably almost a year and a half ago a drag and drop capability from Doors Classic into our web-based tool for doing linking between Doors Classic and Jira. That was all based on discussions and engagement with customers. So we're very open to be able to hear details. We're very attentive to the numbers of clicks it takes to be able to do certain activities. And so you'll see enhancements in our next release on a couple of features because of that. But yeah, we're listening to customers. We're asking questions. I'd love to have more concrete data in terms of those user behaviors, but working with aerospace and defense often makes it a little difficult to be able to get details of how exactly they're using it every day, but we try to be able to stay engaged with our users. Good question.
Great, thank you. So yes, just a huge thank you to Robert. I think his approach is very much in line with the way the Method Park thinks and works. This behavioral pull and human-centric approach there has been the reason, I think, for your continued success across many years now.
Thanks, Duncan. I appreciate that.
Yeah. So yeah, thank you to Robert. Thank you to the audience. And thanks for joining. The next session starts in 13 minutes. With Paul Clements, Dr. Paul Clements from Big Lever. I'm talking about the key issues of organizational structure and processes with feature-based product line engineering and ISO 26580. So thank you very much for joining this session. I hope to see you in just a few talk to you soon. Bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.